Hello. So this video is going to cover tracking abilities that have charges in addition to a cooldown. So something like Angelic Feathers on a Priest. I think Death Strike on Death Knights works that way right now. I should know that, I have one, but I just never play it. Also Shield Block on a Warrior, and probably some other classes have this kind of mechanic as well. Now, unfortunately, Weak Auras does not have a nice point-and-click interface for configuring this kind of thing, so we're going to be doing the legwork ourselves. It's going to involve a fair bit of custom Lua to make this all work properly, and I think what I'm going to have to do is split this into several videos. The first one will cover the sort of bare minimum, here's the basic framework for tracking these kinds of things, and then I'll do a couple of other videos where we customize this minimal display into things like a combo point display or a progress bar, or who knows, maybe like an alert that fires up only when you have a certain number of charges. So I'll leave those for another day, and we'll focus on just getting the bare minimum down today, and then we'll customize it maybe later on this week. I do want to give sort of a nod to the people over on the Vox Immortalis Weak Auras tutoring thread. I posted a solution on MMO Champion that'll work, it'll do the job just fine, but there, I guess it was this Kuldum guy, had this neat trick where he used a local function to determine if you have the right number of charges for an aura to trigger or not. Probably a little more complicated than what I would normally put in my videos, but because it makes things so much easier to modify to make different kinds of displays, I'm going to just rip off his idea wholesale because it's very clever. Like I said, it's more complicated than the Lua I normally like to show, but because it is such a good idea, I'm just going to put it in front of you and try my best to explain it so that you can modify things as you go. Last up, I just want to point out that if you're having trouble doing things in Weak Auras, it always makes sense to check the WoW Ace forums for Weak Auras. The maintainers post there. A lot of fairly knowledgeable people read it and will occasionally post help for things. In this case, I had to go there to find out how the custom duration functions work because it's not documented very well. So if you're struggling with something, you can't find information, the official forums are quite good. Lastly, if you have an idea of what sort of code you need to write, checking the WoW programming events documentation and the API listing for abilities or I guess functions that you can call to learn about abilities that you have is a good idea because it'll point you in the right direction on whether or not this is something that is easily possible with Weak Auras or not. If you don't find something like get spell charges documented this way, there's a good chance that dealing with stuff that involves spell charges is not terribly easy. Now, unfortunately, we do have nice functions, and this is where we're going to be, or rather, I'm going to use these to build an aura. If you want to read more about them, WoW programming is a great place to get a handle on what the UI is all about. There are some forums. They're sort of more general add-on programming forums, so not necessarily as good as, say, the Vox Immortalis or even MMO Champion threads are, but it's still a good resource for someone who's looking to do something very complicated with Weak Auras. Now that we've given credit to all of the people that I'm sort of standing on their shoulders to write these things with, let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring up the Weak Auras options, and I'm going to make a new icon aura. And I'll call this something like, feather, I guess is fine. And I'm going to set load conditions first. Now we need to set load conditions because we're going to be dealing with abilities that are class specific. So Angelic Feathers are only available on a Priest and only if they have talented into them. If we try to get information about that ability when we don't have it, we're going to get Lua errors in our function calls, and that can impact our frame rate because Lua errors are sort of costly for the interpreter to deal with. And if you have an aura that's throwing up 1,000 errors a second, you'll notice that in your frame rates. So we want to make sure that we are diligent in setting load conditions to restrict these to only times when it makes sense to display them. So for my aura here, I know that this ability is only available on Priests, so I'm going to set player class to Priest. And then it's available to every spec, so I'm not going to set that. If you were doing something like a Warrior and you only wanted your shield block aura available in prot spec, then you should set an appropriate talent specialization. And then I'm going to use the talent selected dropdown, and I'm going to choose tier 2 because that's sort of the middle talent in the second tier, which is angelic feathers on a priest. So you can use this to restrict things to abilities you have to talent into, and you should make sure that you're doing that. The next thing we need to do is come over to the trigger, and I'm going to set this to a custom trigger, and the type will be status, and then check on will be every frame. So this approach is a little more CPU intensive than the normal method that I like to use, which is sort of firing off the events. But because we want to recreate this icon down here, and this has sort of cooldown sweeps and progress indicators going on. If I cast all these, you can see that it's got a cooldown going on. Progress indicators like that, like clock displays and progress bars, need to be updated every frame, because if you only drew it whenever the event fired for you to gain a stack or lose a stack, it would only update once every 9 or 10 seconds or whatever the cooldown on this ability is. And that would make our animations basically not happen because it would be all choppy. So to start with, we're going to use the every frame, and then in another video I'll show you how you can convert this to an event-driven method that will be a little less CPU intensive and appropriate for different kinds of displays. Now when I say CPU intensive, I don't mean that you're going to lose like 100 frames per second, but it's sort of one of those every little bit counts things, and we shouldn't be using these if we don't have a good reason to. In our case, we do. We want to display a cooldown progress sweep. Now we need to set the first 3 boxes or functions here, the custom trigger, the custom untrigger, and the duration info. And then I'm also going to set the name and the icon and the stacks info. So that way the standard %n, %p, etc. Display text will just work automatically in the background. So it's kind of a for completeness thing. It will seem a little bit redundant when we look at the actual functions, but I like the idea of having something where most of the standard configuration interface will still work. So to begin with, let's paste in our custom trigger. I'm going to expand the text editor, paste it in there. Now the thing that you need to modify is the first line here where it says spell name, and then whatever's in the quotes is the name of the ability you want to track. So if you were doing a warrior, that would be shield block. You can also put in spell IDs in here. So if you're like, I don't know, maybe internationalizing your auras or something, you could use that. Or if you have something that has like the same name but slightly different behaviors, you can use spell ID as well. The second bit here is that custom function thing I was talking about. Now for our auras, we want them to basically display all of the time. So what I've done is I've set, if the charges are good, that's sort of a function that will check some value and apply some logic to it and tell us whether or not it's good to go. So in our case, we want our aura to trigger as long as we have cooldowns. So if our charges is bigger than 0, which is always true, we always have at least no charges of an aura, then it will display. For our untrigger, we have almost the same function. All we have to do is change our logic. Basically, we want it to never untrigger. So I said if the number of charges that we have is less than 0, which can never happen, then hide this aura. So that'll make it always display. It'll appear immediately and stay on screen until we log out. The next thing I think we're going to do is just kind of skip down to the bottom and get some of these easy functions out of the way, because duration is a bit ugly. So for stacks information, I'm just going to paste that in. And I guess we don't even really need this because I'm just returning the raw number of stacks. So once again, you have a line here. You'll have to change the name of the spell, and that's it. We get the number of stacks that we have by calling the get spell charges method, and we just return it. So that'll be something like 3, 2, 1 for each of our charges. And then when we have none of them available, it'll be nil, so we'll have nothing displayed. Next up is the icon info. And we don't really need to do this because we could just manually set the icon in the display tab, but I like having it work automatically, and it's such a simple function to write that we might as well do it. So here I just have the spell name defined once again, so modify that for your character. and then I say, hey, Warcraft, get me the texture for this particular spell. And so you could use the ID again if you wanted to. Finally, name info. This is probably the most pointless of the functions, just because of the fact that we're using spell name for everything. But once again, we're just having this local spell name equals angelic feather, and then we return that straight up. No fanciness done at all. And so now that we have this really nice consistent local spell name equals this ability, it should be really easy for you to modify these to work for your class. Now the last thing we need to do is our duration function. And for our example, we don't really need to worry too much about editing things, so I'm going to cut and paste this in. And we can see a very similar setup once more. We have to set our spell name on this line, and then we have some load conditions for when we want to display a progress cooldown. Now, in our case, we want our progress cooldown to display all of the time. So if our progress cooldown is 0 because we have a full stack, or like all 3 of our feathers are up, then display it. And if we're missing 1 stack and we're recharging some, we still want to display it no matter how many charges we have left. So this function is very simple. In later auras, we're going to come in here and modify this to do some more complicated logic, and that'll let us get really sort of clever displays where some have cooldowns and some don't. That's why it's split up this way. I tried to use variable names that are sort of self-explanatory. You can kind of walk through this function and see what's going on. There's a little bit of weirdness here just because of the way get spell charges returns. I think it's last cast time or cooldown duration. It's one of the two. When either you haven't cast a spell or when it's completely off cooldown. So when you have all of your charges up, these numbers get really large and things get kind of weird. So this is a little ugly, but hopefully you can follow what's going on. The basic idea is that we return 0, when it's not on cooldown, and if it is on cooldown, we're rebuilding a charge. Then we have to return the time that our ability will take to cool down, and then the time that our ability will be finished cooling down. So in our case, the cooldown duration is something like 10 seconds, and the time it will cool down, or be cooled down when we'll get our next charge, will be the last time we cast it, plus the cooldown duration. That's what's going on here. We could modify this function as well to do things like make 1 progress bar that displays sort of all 3 of our feathers, or all 5 of our death strikes or whatever. We'll have to cover that in another video just because it would make this one longer than it needs to be. We're already getting up there. So with those all pasted in, hopefully you modified the spell names appropriate for your class, we get this basic aura. I think one last thing I'm going to do is just kind of drag it off to the side over here, maybe make it a little larger, something like 128 by 128. And maybe I'll make the stack size a little bigger and choose a better font. So that's not too bad. Let's close this up and see what we get. I know that we're going to have to come back and edit this, but let's just see what pasting in those functions has got us. So the automatic icon has worked and it's chosen when appropriate for this. Our stack count seems to be working. And then if I cast a few of these, we'll see that our stack count goes down, but we're not getting our cooldown progress. But if you've made other auras in the past, you've probably noticed that that's what we expect to happen. We don't get a cooldown sweep unless we specifically ask for it. So I'm going to bring up the weak auras options once more. And I'm going to come under the feather aura. And then on display, I'm going to turn on cooldown. Then I'll close that up. And we can actually see it's giving us our cooldown sweep now. We have all of our stacks, and it's solid. Then if I cast one, we can see it's kind of spinning around that way. Now, because our abilities are recharging, I kind of think that this looks backwards. It should be going the other way. We should be getting brighter and brighter the closer it is to be ready to use. So to make that happen, all we have to do is come back into our aura and choose our inverse option. And one other thing we could do is change the way our stack count is displayed. I don't think that for this kind of aura it's particularly useful because, well, we'll just see. Let's change this to, let's say, %P for progress. So if I close that up, and let's cast this. And there we go. We can see that it's showing how long until we get our next aura. for our next charge of this thing. So I'll cast a couple and we'll just watch it spin around. We can see the time tick up. Now this doesn't display how many we actually have, the fact that I have one more feather I could put down. And so this makes it kind of silly to display it this way. What we would probably want to do is have a custom function that displays something like, maybe this color changes depending on how many stacks we have, or maybe it displays like stacks and then in bracket, like the number of stacks, and then in brackets the cooldown until you get the next one, or something like that. But it does tell us that our progress text is being calculated correctly, so that's good. There we go. You'll notice it stalls out at 0 when we have our last one up, so we probably want a custom function to hide the time until you get your next stack when we don't have any time remaining, and things like that. But this does tell us that our basic setup is working correctly. That's good because it tells us that we are in good position to start making other kinds of displays. So just as a sort of a quick preview for what we can do later on, I'm just going to right click on this and convert it to a progress bar. And under display, I'm going to drag the width up to just being huge. We'll put this in the middle of the screen. And we can see by writing those custom functions, our name is displayed properly, our icon is there, our number of stacks is right. And then as we cast these, we can see that our progress and our stacks update properly. So this puts us in a good position to start creating different kinds of auras, using this as a building, sort of a stepping stone to building something better. I think I'm going to cut this off here, and we'll have to do another video in the next couple of days to continue this. So long.